Genesis chapter 16, I was telling my dad right before the service started, I am pretty much in the habit of, I remember, my notes are on my iPad, and I'm pretty much in the habit of remembering to put my iPad on airplane mode when I'm preaching here. When I went to the college just last week and preached, I forgot to put my iPad on airplane mode, and I don't get called that often, but in the time of preaching, I got 7 calls and 9 text messages. I think I spent more time swiping away notifications than I did preaching. It was something. So I remembered to put it on airplane mode tonight, so I'm excited about that. Genesis chapter 16, I'm going to start reading in verse 1. It says, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold now, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. And he went in unto Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. And Sarai said unto Abram, My wrong be upon thee. I have given my maid into thy bosom. And when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and thee. But Abram said unto Sarai, Behold, thy maid is in thy hand. Do to her as it pleaseth thee. And when Sarai dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face. And the angel of the Lord found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by the fountain in the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, whence camest thou, and whither wilt thou go? And she said, I flee from the face of my mistress Sarai. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Return to thy mistress, and submit thyself under her hands. And the angel of the Lord said unto, if I can get my page turned, said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shalt call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. And he will be a wild man, his hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. And she called the name of the Lord that spake unto her, Thou God seest me. For he said, Have I also here looked after him that seeth thee? Wherefore the well was called Ber-Lahai-Roi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bare Abram a son, and Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bare Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abraham. Let's go ahead and pray. Lord, I want to thank you for the time we can have in your word. Lord, I pray that you will use this time. I pray that you will help me and my inabilities not to get in the way of your word and your message this evening. Lord, I pray that you will speak to us. I pray this in your name. Amen. You can go ahead and be seated. Continuing on, I mentioned this a few weeks ago when I preached, and I know Brother Rick Tigg preached on Abram as well, but I'm going to, for this week and at least one more, be preaching on him. We all know that Abram made some great choices for God. 2 weeks ago, I spent a little time on that, and had said at that time that we're going to be focusing on him for a few weeks. And I know Brother Rick Tigg did as well. I know Pastor has over the last few weeks touched on some areas also. Abram is known as a great man of God, and for plenty of reason. 2 weeks ago, I pointed that out, that he's listed in what's often referred to as the Hall of Faith. He was a man of faith who trusted God and followed God, chose to obey God even when it didn't make sense. He was a man of God who obeyed God, and because of it, he was used to be the father of God's people. But as we know, he wasn't a perfect man. He sinned. He messed up. And I really think that's important for us to see that. And maybe I spend too much time looking at that sort of thing. But I really do try to point out when the Bible shows us the sin of men like Abraham. Not because I think we ought to focus on sin, but it reminds us that they're human. Otherwise, it becomes very easy for us to put men like Abraham on a pedestal and think of them almost godlike and forget that they were men just like us. We see an example of that on the Mount of Transfiguration, that the disciples are there and Jesus is there and Moses and Elijah are there with Jesus, great men of God, but men. And the apostles see that, and their response is, we should worship all three of them, forgetting they're just men. And we can do the same, that we put those men on a pedestal that's too high, which brings some problems in. When we put men on a pedestal as higher than just men, it can cause issues. It can cause our focus to be on the wrong thing. Brought up the Mount of Transfiguration. Their focus was on Moses and Elijah instead of Jesus. There are some great men in the Bible, and I don't want to downplay that. I don't want us to miss out on that fact that there are some great men and some great women of the Bible, but the Bible doesn't give us the story of their lives so that we can reverence these men and women. It gives us them so that we can learn about our God. And when we put those people too high, we miss that. We get our focus on what they achieved. We get our focus on what they did rather than focusing on how God used them. When we put these men higher than men, another issue that comes is we struggle when they fall. I'll just be straightforward here. That's true of men in the Bible. That's true of men in history. That's true of men today. That we are often guilty of putting people that we see as great men of God on a pedestal. Maybe we see the success that they had, or we see the ministry that they have, and we put them as higher. The problem is they're men. And men, no matter how good they are still just men, and men mess up. So we place them in this high place, and we're looking to them to be more than just men. We struggle when they fall. While I studied for this, it reminded me, it wasn't too many years ago that I was counseling with someone who was struggling with that, because the person that had witnessed to them, and the person who had invited them to church, and the person who had a major spiritual influence on their life, got mad at God and quit church. And they were struggling because, well, this person had such a huge influence on my life spiritually, and now they're not here. They had put that person on a pedestal. We have to be careful to remember that men are just men, or we struggle when they mess up. And I say when, not if, on purpose, because we're all sinners. When we put men higher than they ought to be, we focus on the wrong thing and we struggle when they fall. But also, when we put men as higher than just men, we doubt that God can do the same thing with us. I have heard so many people who see what God did with men in the Bible and say things like, yeah, but that was Moses. God could never do that with me. Or yeah, but that was Paul. Or yeah, but that was the disciples. Or even more recent, yeah, but that's pastor or whoever else it may be, implying that somehow they were something more than what you are. They're men who let God use them. But when we put men higher than men, we somehow get the idea that God used them because they in themselves were something special, but I'm not, so God couldn't use me. It's an excuse. It sounds a whole lot like Gideon, making excuses of why God couldn't use him since he was the youngest from a small family, from a small tribe. God couldn't use me to lead the people, doubting that God could use anyone, because, well, we think it has to be someone that is something special. It's important that we remember men are just men. So I believe it's important for us to see men like Abraham, who was a man of faith, recognized in God's word as a man of faith, a man used by God, but was just a man. So with that as introduction to the message, I want to look at three choices that Abraham made. And like 2 weeks ago, I'm going to use Abram and Abraham interchangeably here, so bear with me on that. Abram chose his time instead of God's. Look at chapter 16, verse 1 through 3 again with me. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. Now, I'll say this before I really get into this point. I'm saying Abram's choices. I realize it was he and his wife. They're married. They're one flesh. I'm counting it as one choice. It makes sense. So this choice, his timing rather than God's. Abram, a man of faith, a man used of God, a man who had left everything he knew because God told him to, and yet questioned God's timeline. God had promised him that he'd be the father of many nations. Pastor touched on this on Sunday, but he has this promise to be the father of many nations, but is yet to be the father of one. This is going to be a challenge. He and Sarah recognize they're getting old, and God's made this promise, but they haven't been able to have children, and this is a big deal. In those days specifically, the family name was a big thing. Your lineage was important. Doesn't seem as big of a deal now. It's not uncommon for people not to have kids now, but in those days that wasn't the case. This was a big deal. And there was this promise from God that had gone unfulfilled for these years. So here's what happened. It started a chain reaction. It started with that they doubted God's promise. They began to reason with themselves that we know that God made this promise, but it hasn't happened yet, so maybe he really won't be able to come through. You know, I realize God's made this promise, but it's been a lot of years. Maybe he's not going to come through on it. And before we get too judgmental on this, it had been a lot of years. I mean, they've been waiting for God to come through on this for a long time, and it hadn't happened. You think about it, they had been patient to wait for his timing to this point, but when it took longer than they wanted to wait, they began to doubt that God could really deliver. So what do? They made their own plan. They wanted to have kids, and God had promised them children, but it hadn't happened. So maybe we can give God a nudge. You know, maybe we can just take things in our own hands, help him out a little bit. You know, God means well, but you know, for whatever reasons it hasn't happened. So maybe we can just help this out a little bit. And that's what they did. We read it. Sarah gives Abram her handmaid to have a child with. How either of them thought this was a good idea, I have no idea, but they did, and immediately it causes strife and contention and issues because they decided they could take it into their own hands. They could come up with their own plan. Abram and Sarah chose their time right now rather than God's. God had made a promise, but it took too long. They took it in their own hands. They tried to speed up God's timing, which really isn't an uncommon thing. Maybe we don't see it as extreme as Abram and Sarah did, but it's not uncommon that we take a promise that God has given us into our own hands. It's not uncommon that God's promised us something, and rather than us choosing, I'm going to wait for him to do it in his timing, we decide we're going to do it in our own. I'll give some really basic examples. Bible tells us, my God shall supply all your needs according to his riches and glory. That tells me that I can trust God to take care of me. it tells me that he's going to supply my needs and that he is capable of caring for me. You notice in that, though, it doesn't tell me when. And very often, the way and the time which he chooses to care for me is not when and how I think it ought to happen. So what do we often do? We find a way to supply our own need. We make our own timing. Or how about the promises like we find in the 23rd Psalm, for an example, that he leads, that he leadeth me. The promise that we see throughout the Bible that God will show us the way and he'll direct our paths, he'll lead us, but how many times is it that his leading doesn't happen when we want it to, so we just force a door open? Kind of that mindset of, God, you promised to lead me and I'm ready to go, but you aren't showing where, so I'm just going to go. It never ends well. We're choosing our timing rather than waiting for his. Just like for Abram and Sarai and Hagar, anytime we choose our timing over God's, it ends in strife and contention. I mentioned that with Ishmael. Abram gets a woman who is not his wife pregnant, and that is going to cause stress in the home every single time. And I know that's an extreme, but it's true in other areas as well. When you and I decide that we don't want to wait for God's timing on something, and we start to doubt his promise, and we start to doubt that he'll follow through, so we make our own way, it never leads to good things. It can only produce problems. I can't stress enough the importance of waiting on God's time. Psalm 37:34, wait on the Lord, keep his way, and he shall exalt thee to inherit the land. When the wicked are cut off, thou shalt see it. Proverbs 20, verse 22, say not thou, I will recompense evil, but wait on the Lord, and he shall save thee. We cause ourselves so much heartache and problems in our life simply because we decided not to wait on God. Because we have things we want to do and things that we want to accomplish, and we don't wait on him. Sometimes those things are even good things. Abram having children wasn't a bad thing. In fact, it was God's will. God had promised that he was going to have children. It was a good thing. But a good thing done out of God's time is a bad thing. Yeah. Even when it's a good thing, if it's not in God's time, it's a bad thing. Choices. Abram chose his time over God's, and it caused him problems. Number two, Abram chose his way over God's. Look at chapter 17 with me. Chapter 17, starting in verse 1. When Abram was 90 years old and 9, the Lord appeared to Abram and said unto him, I am the Almighty God, walk before me and be thou perfect, and I will make my covenant between me and thee, and I will multiply thee exceedingly. And Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be the father of many nations. Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, but thy name shall be called Abraham. For a father of many nations have I made thee, and I will make thee exceeding fruitful, and I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee. Skip down to verse 18 with me. It says, And Abram said unto God, Oh, that Ishmael might live before thee. So follow this here. Abram's already doubted God's time. He's already made his own and followed his own plan because God wasn't coming through fast enough. He's already taken things into his own hands, and God comes to him and reconfirms this promise with Abram. And I find it interesting, nowhere you read, I know we skipped past some of it, you read chapter 17, nowhere does God bring up Ishmael in that. He doesn't smack Abraham around for his mistake. He doesn't scold him for rushing this. He doesn't do any of that. He just states his promise again. I think if I were God, I would have asked Abram, why didn't you wait? I think I would have wanted to scold him for doubting. He just states his promise again. But what I want to focus on is the response of Abraham. Because it wasn't what I would expect. you would think when God comes to you and reaffirms this promise that it would be excitement for what God was going to do. Be a reasonable response. Excited that God hasn't forgotten, and excited to see what God's going to do, and excited about the fact that God is going to work. His response wasn't excitement. His response wasn't even remorse for what he had done. You have to think, when God comes to you and says, hey, I haven't forgotten my promise, I'm still going to do it, but oops, I already took that in my own hands, that you'd have some remorse, that you'd realize, hey, I messed up in this. But that's not even his response. Instead, he chooses, he responds in this way, that he responds by trying to explain his reasoning to God. He justifies. He justifies. I love that Abraham feels he needs to explain to God that he's old and that Sarah's past childbearing age. I mean, to me, that's a little comical, and I'm not trying to make light of it, but he is explaining to the one who created man how the human body works. Really? But that's what he does. That's what his justification is. God, we're old, we're past that, so, just let me tell you what I did instead. Now, that doesn't sound like us at all, right? We never try to justify or explain why we did what we did. That's what Abraham does. Rather than owning up to his sin, rather than admitting to God what he had done and asking forgiveness, he tried to justify to God by explaining his reasoning. And then he takes it a step further. He tries to sway God. We read verse 18, and we read it again. Abram said unto God, oh, that Ishmael might live before thee. Here's what Abraham is doing. Rather than making it right, rather than admitting his fault and submitting to God's plan for his life, Abraham says, God, I know what you wanted, and I know what your plan was, but here's what I already did. Don't you think you could just bless that? I know that this is what you really wanted for me, but I've already done this. Could you just bless that? Could Ishmael just live before thee? I said this already. You'd think that Abraham would be excited about what God wanted to do. He just promised him again the child that had been promised years before. This should be an exciting time of God working, and instead he tries to convince God that instead of keeping his promise, that God would just bless his sin. That God would just bless his choice. What Abraham is doing is choosing his sin, what he had already done, while he was being impatient over not wanting to wait for God. He chose his way, Ishmael, over what God wanted to do. This is something we do all the time. We get impatient, and rather than waiting for God, and rather than waiting for his time, and rather than waiting for his way, we force our way through something. We force a door open, and then when confronted on it, rather than changing what we're doing, we often just ask God to bless it. With the mindset, God, I know I should have waited for you, but I didn't. Rather than me having to give this up, don't you think, this could be okay? We get ourselves into all sorts of problems because rather than waiting, we jumped into something, and now that we see our error, rather than making it right, we refuse to give it up. And we just hope God will bless it anyways. I spoke to someone not real long ago that this was their words. They told me, I know I'm not in God's perfect will, but I'm not ready to give this up, so I'm just praying it's his permissible will. That was what he said to me, that he knew he was not in God's perfect will, but this is where he wanted to be. So he's just praying it would be God's permissible will. And I know him well enough to know, and he's told me this, he's miserable. And when we had this conversation, I read this verse to him. Told him, you're praying that God would bless your Ishmael. It's a sad way to live. It's Abraham did here, and that's very often what we choose. Abram chose his time rather than God's. Abram chose his way rather than God's. And then lastly tonight, and kind of seeing this from the other side, Abram chose to make it right. Look at chapter 17, verse 19 with me. And God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant with his seed after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at this time in the next year. And he left off talking with him, and God went up from Abraham. And Abraham took Ishmael his son, and all that were born in his house, and all that were bought with his money, every male among them of Abraham's house, and circumcised the flesh their foreskin in the selfsame day as God had said unto him. Abraham messed up. It's clear that he didn't wait for God. He found his own way, and he committed to that and made his own plan. He chose his time and his way. He doubted God's promise. He's made a mess of things. I mean, there's no other way to describe this. He now has two wives that hate each other, and a child that the Bible talks about, or that the Bible talked about, is going to be against every man. I mean, he's made a mess of things. But in the end, he recognized his mistake and makes it right. The last verse that we read, I ended there on purpose, that Abraham did as God had said unto him. He made it right. He turned back to God. Abraham, this is a great man of God and a great example of what we ought to do, but not because he's flawless. It's rather because of what he does after his mistakes. You look at the life of Abram, we can see multiple times that he messed up. 2 weeks ago, we looked at his error in Egypt, that he messed up and ends up, turns back to God. Tonight, we see this with Hagar and Ishmael, but in the end, he returns to God. We see him later on in Genesis go into Egypt again and make the same mistake again later, and it ends with him making it right. Abraham isn't a man of God and a man who's known by his faith because he was perfect. It isn't because he didn't mess up. He's known as that because of what he does after. That though he messed up, he turned back to God. I'm going to make an assumption here. I'm going to assume that everyone that's here desires to be an Abraham. I'm going to assume that every one of us in here wants the testimony of being a man or a woman of faith. I'm going to assume that every one of us in here wants to be used of God. So if that's true, pay attention here, because I want to give some key characteristics of a man or woman of God. The first, they're all flawed. They're all flawed. You cannot find an example biblically or otherwise of a man or woman of God that is without error. I recognize that the Bible doesn't list the sins of every one of them, so I know that someone could try to argue that, but the Bible also makes it very clear that all have sinned. So while it may not have pointed out their sin, it's there. The same is true of men or women of God throughout history and men and women of God today. They may not be, currently doing things, but they are flawed. They all have a sin problem. I don't care who it is we're talking about. It could be the greatest man or woman that you can think of. They're flawed. All have sinned is pretty all-inclusive, which is really, it's going to sound funny, it's really great news, because that means it doesn't disqualify you. That just because you're flawed doesn't mean you can't be a godly man or woman. The next key characteristic of a godly man or woman is they know they're flawed. And this really is where it starts to be a separation. because all have sinned, we're all flawed, but not everyone sees that about themselves. Some absolutely refuse to admit they have fault. Even when it's something that is extremely obvious, they never see it. If you want to be used of God, learn some humility and to see that you have fault. I'm not talking about a false sense of humility that tears yourself down, sees yourself as no good for anything. I'm talking about that recognizes I have flaws, I'm a sinner. But then the third key characteristic of a godly man or woman I want us to see, that with God's help they correct those flaws. Think of Proverbs 24, verse 16. For a just man falleth 7 times and riseth up again. You notice, he doesn't say a just man never falls. He says he falls 7 times. He falls over and over and over again. But then he doesn't just wallow in that falling. He doesn't wallow in his failure. He gets back up again. Because here's the reality. It's not about whether or not you're flawed, whether or not you sin. You do. It's about what you do after that. Conclusion this evening. Abraham, he made some mistakes. There's no doubt about that, no question. Abraham chose his time rather than God's. Abraham chose his way over God's. But then Abraham chose to return to God. He made it right. He recognized his sin. He recognized what he had done. And he turned back to God. Here's the application this evening. If you want to be a man or woman used of God, man of woman or woman of faith, that doesn't mean you'll be perfect. You'll still sin. You'll still mess up. But if you recognize your sin, with God's help correct your sin, you can still be used of Him. Let's pray. Lord, I pray that you will that you'll use this evening, Lord. I know a little bit different in the way I ended it, Lord. I believe in this room that everyone in here would say they want to be a man or woman of God. That all of us in here would say, I want to be a person of faith. Lord, help us to recognize that doesn't mean I have to be a perfect person. Because if that's the bar, I'm never going to hit it. But instead to recognize that when I fall, I stand back up again. I just keep turning to you. See that with Abraham, that he was not perfect. He was flawed. He made mistakes. And after each one, he recognized the mistake, recognized his sin, and turned back to you. Lord, help us to do the same. To recognize I'm not perfect, and I sin,